This is the second video in which I'm looking at the advantages of double boxing items when you ship them, and specifically here we're talking about vintage items that are irreplaceable or delicate, but also why improper double boxing can actually make things worse. Thanks to everyone that commented on the first video. Just to cover a couple of the comments, someone said that manufacturers don't ship new items in bubble wrap. True, that's a bit of a straw man argument. We're not talking here about designing OEM packaging. What we're talking about here is shipping vintage equipment when the OEM packaging is not available. That is, where the original packaging has long since been discarded. We're talking here about the best way to ship vintage items, especially delicate ones. Someone else suggested using foam in place packaging. That's where you inject an expanding foam into the packaging around the item to give it proper protection. Yes, you can do that if you've got the ability, but what I'm trying to get across here is that for the average person trying to ship something, there are easy ways to give the items a chance of survival. If I start making suggestions that everyone should use something like foam in place and things like that, and designing specific packaging, then obviously no one's going to do it. We'll just end up not gaining anything. What I'm trying to get across here is that using nothing more than bubble wrap, cardboard boxes and a bit of common sense, you can give very good protection to items when you ship them. Someone else commented that for heavy items you should use a dense, heavy internal packaging for the internal box. You can if you want. I actually disagree with that. I'll explain why in this video. I generally always use bubble wrap, even on heavy items. Large heavy items I've shipped using nothing more than bubble wrap and boxes, and it works extremely well. You do not need, and this is a very dense item, you do not need to use specific packaging for the inner box. Now if you've got the ability to make specific packaging, shape it properly, then yes, it may well add protection. But that's the important thing. It's about shaping the packaging if it's dense. And that's what OEMs do when they make specific packaging. However, you can't expect someone to make specific packaging for items they're going to ship. Otherwise, chances are they just end up throwing it in a skip, and then we're not really gaining anything. What I'm trying to get across is that there are fairly easy ways using nothing more than bubble wrap to successfully ship even large, delicate vintage equipment around. And specifically, if you wrap them inappropriately, you'll actually increase the chance of damaging something. So that's what this video is about. It's going to demonstrate how you can actually make things worse by adding more packaging. So when in the first video I showed the sensor I'd made, and it's an area sensor, so there are various force sensors in this, and it measures the average force across the area, so it's flat. But that's rarely the case with items. Most items, especially vintage equipment, have a protuberance or more, even if it's only by virtue of having corners. And to simulate that, I've added this knob onto the sensor, and this is to give us an analog to a corner or a knob or something on the item that is sticking out. And that's almost always the case on vintage equipment. There's nearly always the case that something's poking out of it. As I say, it may even just be the corners. And that's where the problems start, because of course if you drop that item, even if it's packaged, then most of the force, if the packaging is inappropriate, is going to be absorbed by the parts that are sticking out. So that's what we're going to investigate. We're going to see how proper packaging can make a big difference, and how inappropriate packaging can actually make things worse. So we'll go through a similar process as we did in the first video. We'll start with no packaging and then go through various levels of packaging and show how the correct packaging can make a big difference to the force that the item is subject to. Obviously, the greater the force, the greater the jolt, the more chances of damage. And as I said, it's not just about protecting the outside of the item, it's also trying to reduce the jolt the item receives, which is one of the reasons you don't want to use stiff packaging on the inner box. That kind of defeats the purpose, and also it can increase the chance of damage, as we'll investigate here. So we'll start off by just giving a very gentle knock to this, and as you can see, even a gentle knock on the scope, you get quite a considerable force. And not only that, it's a very sharp edged force. You can see it's got very sharp edges, and as I said in the first video, the sharper the spike edge, the more of a jolt the item has received. Now in this case, it's not going to make a great deal of difference between hitting this part that's poking out and the flat surface, because the force is going to be about the same. And this is where packaging starts making a difference. So we'll start off with a single piece of cardboard. So if we put the cardboard in here, reset the scope, and if we swing this, again I'm not pulling the weight all the way out at this point, I don't want to damage the sensor, and if we let this go, you can see that we get quite a jolt. What I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to use a screwdriver, and we'll use the shadow that's on the bench to determine how far back to pull this, and that way I can be sure that I'm getting it the same each time. I don't know if you can actually see the shadow on the bench, but that's what we use as our point of release. So we'll do that one more time, out to where the shadow meets the tip of the screwdriver. We'll release it, and you can see on the scope we're getting quite a considerable spike. We'll try our favourite method of protection. We'll write the word fragile on the cardboard. And as you can see, it makes absolutely no difference whatsoever. Although this is kind of a joke, this is something that people seem to think makes a big difference, writing the word fragile on a package, and it really seems to make no difference whatsoever. I don't think couriers even read these anymore. I think whatever you write on the box is completely ignored. I packaged something up very carefully to ship over to the US a little while ago, and I put about 6 stickers, pretty much one on each side, saying "this way up," to try and make sure it was always put the right way up. And just out of interest, now it didn't actually matter, I did it just as an exercise, and out of interest I watched the courier come and collect it, and by the time he'd moved it from where he'd picked it up into his van, it was upside down. And that's with 6 stickers on there saying "this way up," and it had symbols and indicators and arrows, but even so it ended up upside down within 20 seconds of it being collected. So this sort of thing doesn't really make any difference. It's up to you as the shipper to take whatever actions, whatever measures are required to protect the item. Now what we have to do here is to avoid force concentrated on the items or the parts of the item sticking out, and the only way you can do that is to put something here that will absorb the energy and spread it out. The energy is going to be the same, you just need to spread it out and absorb it. So what we can do, of course, is put some bubble wrap in here, and what the bubble wrap does is it conforms to the shape of the item, and as we hit it, it spreads the load out, and it tries to put some of the force through the outer part of the packaging. The cardboard helps by spreading the load out across the surface of the bubble wrap. It's not there just to stop the bubble wrap falling out. If we now reset the scope, we'll pull back to the same point. So I'm going back to the same point with the same shadow. I'm actually holding these in place, but I'm not applying any force, I'm just stopping it falling over. If I now release this, you can see a much lower spike. So what I'm going to do now is move the screwdriver further back so we get more force. Okay, so we'll release the weight, And what we'll do now is we'll save this as our reference. So the white trace on the scope is now our reference trace. And what we'll do now is the inappropriate way of double boxing, which is where you wrap the item in cardboard, then put some bubble wrap in, and then put that in another box. Reset the scope. Okay, and hopefully you can see that the force is actually higher. Not only that, but it's a narrower trace, which means the jolt the item has received is actually greater. So this is a log scale, by the way, so even though it looks like a fairly small increase in amplitude, it's actually quite a significant increase in the force that the item is seeing. And you'll get the same if you use a stiff inner packaging. This is what I was saying about just putting stiff packaging on the inner box. Can make things worse. Now if you properly shape it, and if you got bits sticking out, if you make a cutout in the stiff packaging so it spreads the load out, then it can improve things. But I'm not suggesting that people should be forced to go to those measures. What I'm trying to get across here is that simple, proper wrapping in bubble wrap and nothing more can greatly improve the chances of the item surviving. And as I say, it's not, if you want to go to the time and trouble of making very specific packaging, you can do that. In theory it should help, but just wrapping something in the inappropriate materials that we often see isn't going to help. You know, wrapping them in your socks or your underpants or something isn't going to protect them in shipping. So now on to the correct way of double boxing. And this is to wrap the inner item in several good layers of bubble wrap. If you want to use something else, you can. Don't just wrap it in something stiff and heavy, because that will defeat the entire purpose of what we're trying to achieve here. If we get something like large cell bubble wrap, then what this will do is it will allow anything like this that's sticking out to kind of, the bubble wrap will conform to the shape. The force will be evened out by the inner layer of cardboard, but it won't just transmit the force straight through to the item. The outer bubble wrap basically duplicates all that. It allows the force to be spread out and reduced. I'll move this back a bit, because otherwise the force will be reduced anyway, because the packaging is getting fairly thick at this point. And what we can do now is repeat the exercise. So we'll pull the weight back to the same point, and I'll release it. And hopefully you can see, as I said, it's a log scale, but hopefully you can see that the force is it's pretty much an order of magnitude lower. And so it's log scales and it's half the amplitude. So this represents a force that is very much lower than it was before. So the white trace, if you recall, was the bubble wrap and cardboard only. If we tried cardboard, bubble wrap, cardboard, we got a higher spike, so it's worse. But now that we've got bubble wrap, cardboard, bubble wrap, cardboard, i.e. the proper method for double boxing, we are getting a peak force that is very much less than it was. Not only that, but hopefully you can see one of the main things with this trace is how shallow the curve is, and that represents the shock force applied to the item, and it is a very slow rise in force. So in other words, the energy has been dissipated over a period of time. It's been spread out. Now bear in mind, we're still reading all the force because it's an area sensor. That's why I designed it this way. So it's not like we're ignoring a lot of the energy being imparted onto the item. It's still all present in the data the sensors are picking up. But the force seen by the item is much, much lower, despite having this lump sticking out of it. So what I'm trying to get across here is that using nothing more than bubble wrap, and if we take the inner bubble wrap out again to show the wrong way to pack, and as you can see, much higher spike again. But if we go back to the proper method, the way again to get the correct distance, reset the scope. It hasn't even triggered the scope that time. We'll try again. Let's reduce the trigger level a bit. And so you can see the force now is very small. It does make a massive difference, and it's not because the bubble wrap is particularly effective, more so than the rest. It's this structure, this bubble wrap cardboard, the way these work together, that makes the difference. And it does make a massive difference. So even something with the lump sticking out, we can properly protect using this method. Now of course, if we put more inner layers, it's the inner layers here that make the biggest difference. If we put more inner layers, basically what you need is enough inner packaging, enough padding to allow the bubble wrap to conform to the shape of what you're trying to protect before it's allowed to impact the cardboard. That's the entire purpose of this inner bubble wrap. And then the outer bubble wrap is just to protect that inner assembly, so to speak. As I say, this is why stiff inner packaging is not a good idea. If you put something stiff on the inside here, it's not going to work properly. You're going to be focusing the force again on the very thing you're trying to protect. If you make a cutout in the stiffer packaging, that's fine. The problem there is, like I said, I'm trying to avoid making it sound like you have to put days of work into packaging something. All I'm suggesting here is if you give it a good layer or several layers of bubble wrap, put it into a cardboard box, several more layers of bubble wrap, and then into a bigger outer box, that is going to, in 99% of the cases, give more than adequate protection. And every time I've used this method, whether it's a dense item, a light item, fragile, had a CRT in it, didn't matter, it's never been damaged. So it doesn't take a lot, it's just a bit of common sense, bit of effort, and you can avoid destroying something that is often irreplaceable. If you want to go to greater measures, just try to make sure that what you're doing is actually appropriate. Just putting more packaging material isn't necessarily going to help if it's the wrong sort of material. Just try to bear in mind what we're trying to achieve here, which is to allow the inner box to not focus force on any particular part of the item, and then the outer packaging is there to dampen any forces applied to the inner box. Okay, that's it for this series. I won't keep banging on about this anymore. If there's anything in particular you want me to demonstrate relating to this, then please leave a comment. But if you are intending to sell something on eBay or anywhere else, and it's a priceless or irreplaceable item, or it's fragile, then please consider wrapping it in this method. It will save you a lot of time and effort in not having to deal with an angry buyer who's received something that's been destroyed in transit. Don't rely on the couriers to do your work for you. They don't care. They're not going to take care with an item, doesn't matter what you write on it. They're just going to chuck it in their van, chuck it on your doorstep and drive off. They don't care. It's up to you to be defensive and get the item packaged in such a way that it's going to survive. And even if you insure it, if the item turns up and the outer box is not damaged, you won't get anything from the courier for insurance. The only time they're going to pay out is if the entire packaging has been destroyed and is no longer protecting the item the way it was intended. But if you've packed it inappropriately and it's been damaged despite your packaging, then you're not going to get anything out of the courier for insurance.